and hi Carolyn. Thank you so much for joining me today as we shine a spotlight on some of the social and ethical issues surrounding genomics. So today we're going to be kind of covering the ethical issues surrounding gene editing technologies, looking both at the current situation but also in a more futuristic sense. But before we do that, Carolyn, if you could introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your background and everything like that.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you today. I'm currently a faculty affiliate with the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. And I'm also Director of Research Ethics Education at the Translational Research Education and Careers Unit in NYU CTSI, which is also part of NYU Grossman School of Medicine. And so I've had a kind of a winding path to bioethics. I first started as a bench scientist. I got my PhD in genetics at Harvard Medical School, studying yeast cell cycle genetics. And then from there, I actually went to the business side of science, and I worked as a business management consultant for pharmaceutical companies, and I worked at a biopharmaceutical startup, and I worked as a freelance science writer. And then after spending a few years with my kids, raising my kids, I decided to re-enter my career by going back for a master's in bioethics at Columbia. And then since I got my master's, I worked at Columbia a bit, teaching in administration of their program. And then I went to do a postdoc with Art Kaplan and Allison Bateman House at NYU in medical ethics. So that's kind of where it's kind of winding, but I've worn a lot of different hats. And so I think that gives me certainly interesting perspective to lean on as I think about medical ethics issues.
So as like a bioethicist, you're quite obviously aware of how much genomics is kind of becoming increasingly integrated into society. And I think with the whole pandemic, even the public are hearing more about genomics. I mean, we can't blink without hearing about just kind of variants emerging and stuff like that. But with gene editing, I always think that people kind of assume that that's kind of a futuristic thing, that we're always oh, in the future when we can do this, but we actually can do that. We can edit the genome and quite well. And I think one of the areas that obviously that's been shown to be effective is gene therapy. And I wondered if you could just kind of give an overview of the history of gene therapy and kind of the current landscape as well.
Sure. As a geneticist, as a trained geneticist, gene therapy, or sort of the concept that good DNA could be used to fix bad DNA or non-functional DNA, has sort of been the holy grail of clinical genetics. And so I remember when I was first entering graduate school in genetics class in that fall of 1993, if you will, I was in class, and my professor stressed at the time that it took a lot of time to identify a gene that was causing a particular disease that known to be, a genetic disease. But that even despite that challenge, once the gene was identified, that scientists still didn't have a way to treat that disease. Even knowing the cause of the disease, there wasn't a clear path to treatment based on that knowledge. And so here we are, basically 30 years later, and we have been able to identify many, many more gene disease links. In other words, we've become very good at identifying how variants are associated with disease, genotype and phenotype links. And that's because of the power of the Human Genome Project and a lot of other technology advances, like the cost of DNA sequencing, for example. But we still have a hard time figuring out how to leverage that knowledge to treat and cure genetic disease. But I think that we're really at an inflection point now. And so as defined by, and by the way, I'm probably going to have a very US focus here because I'm based in the United States. And so that's kind of where the soup I'm living in, so I apologize for that. But I guess so just to kind of give that caveat. So in the US, the FDA defines gene therapy as anything that is, used to modify or manipulate the expression of a gene in order to treat or cure disease. And it may involve introducing a new gene, or modifying a gene or inactivating a gene or replacing a disease-causing gene with a healthy copy. So, and although this kind of in theory sounds straightforward and easy, it's, just to give someone a good copy of what's broken in their bodies. And in reality, it's been extremely very challenging, and it's mainly been due to issues around delivery. So in 1999, the field suffered a very big setback when a patient named Jesse Gelsinger actually died as a result of receiving a gene therapy. And the reason he died is because he had a severe immune reaction to the vector that was used to deliver the gene that he had a problem with in his body. But basically the coverage of that event, that the science just had moved too quickly from bench to bedside, and that there wasn't enough, precautions taken, really set the field back, and actually probably also made them realize that we didn't have a firm grasp of how to deliver gene therapies safely. So it's taken a really long time to get to the point where scientists have been able to figure out ways to deliver gene therapies into humans safely. And so in the United States, there are now a handful of products that fall under the definition of gene therapy that are now on the market. And there are also hundreds more in various stages of clinical development. And so it's a really exciting time. And just if you just to name a few of them, there's what's known as a few CAR T therapies, which are chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapies, in which T cells are removed from a patient's body and then genetically modified to be able to express chimeric antigen receptors that can specifically target the patient's cancer, such as lymphoma, and then infuse back into the body. There's also a gene therapy for an eye disease that causes vision loss due to mutations in the RPE65 gene. And basically that therapy involves just delivery of a good copy of RPE65, and it's given through an injection into the eye. And then there's also an example of Novartis has developed a treatment for spinal muscular atrophy, in which they basically provide a good copy of the gene that is mutated in patients, called SMN. The gene that's problematic in the patients is SMN1. They basically just deliver a good copy, and that's done by infusion into the vein. And so that's really exciting because it's a one-time treatment that causes very serious disease. And so I think it's opened up the possibility for a lot of other patients with other types of genetic diseases.
So gene therapies, obviously they go through a lot of preclinical and also clinical research, and which makes them kind of not cheap. So who currently has access to these therapies, and how can we ensure that there is equity of access to these therapies? Because obviously I think people are probably concerned that obviously the wealthy are going to get the best treatment and stuff like that.
Yeah, so and these are really good and important concerns that ethicists would certainly be concerned about along with you. And so, I mean, in terms of who controls access, obviously the companies that have gone through the development process and own the products and have obtained marketing authorization, they set the prices. So that's one consideration. But as you said, it's very expensive to develop these products and test them. And also oftentimes, at least the current therapies, the patient populations can be relatively small. And so to recoup their costs, they have, there's examples you can look up that they're extremely expensive. And so that the company pricing is one factor, but it sort of can be understandable in terms of, and I think patients can understand that we want these companies to succeed so that more companies will enter the space and we will have more options for therapies for genetic related diseases. And of course, insurance companies also play a role, whether that's a government insurance or a private insurance, like, in the US or elsewhere. And so insurance companies, some of them may include gene therapies in their coverage plans and some may not. There's been pushback from patient advocates and patient groups. Like, for example, there's a group called Maisie's Army that fought for a toddler's coverage on insurance for the SMA treatment. And then patients might also appeal to companies directly if they don't have insurance, or if their insurance isn't covering through patient assistance mechanisms or programs. And then some patients have resorted to things like GoFundMe to raise money for direct payment of medical expenses for a variety of things. I think, and also that would probably include gene therapies as well. And another question will be, of course, global access. And I heard actually just yesterday that the American Society for Gene and Cell Therapy is planning a conference in June on, addressing the challenges of global access, for example, for patients in developing or lower income countries, which of course will be extremely challenging, because oftentimes these, some of the gene therapies need to be, particularly the CAR T, for example, where there's, you have to take cells out, modify them, put the cells back in, which is a complex supply chain. Medical centers have to establish, expertise. So there's also a geographic access issue as well. So that's going to be a challenging thing to address and needs attention. I think most people would hope that it's early days of this new therapeutic class, and that hopefully pricing will go down and that will increase access over time as competition comes in and the industry gets more comfortable and familiar with the technology too.
Yeah, like as you mentioned, like I think it's like so heartbreaking when you see like people setting up like GoFundMe pages and things like that just to kind of get like the money to kind of get access to this type of therapy. Even within in this country, if the NHS don't fund it, people trying to like go to different countries and stuff like that to get these types of like CAR T cell therapies. I recently saw that you kind of co-authored a paper about expanded access. Would you be able to kind of like discuss that a little bit further, and what are the challenges of this kind of access?
Yeah, sure. So I should mention that another way that patients can access gene therapies is by participating in clinical trials. That would be before the gene therapy is approved, so it would be experimental. But in that case, not all patients will qualify for the trial because they might not meet inclusion criteria, which is developed in the protocol for a variety of reasons, for safety. But because, so in terms of the paper you're talking about, I guess I should step back and explain what expanded access is first. So for patients who don't qualify for a clinical trial, in the United States and in many other countries, there's a pathway called expanded access, which is in the US regulated by the FDA. So if you don't qualify for a clinical trial and you have a severe or life-threatening disease, and for which obviously gene therapies are typically targeting, given their level of risk at this stage in this new therapeutic class, patients can appeal to the company to get access to that investigational product outside of a clinical trial. And it's entirely up to the company to decide whether or not to grant such access. And there's certainly no legal or ethical obligation to do so because these are experimental products. But in that paper that you're referencing, a few of my colleagues and I, we put forth the opinion that we believe that it's ethically appropriate for companies to proactively think about the potential to receive expanded access requests, given that gene therapies are being developed for serious and life-threatening diseases, and further that they're being developed for diseases that may have a short window of therapeutic opportunity. And so patients are really desperate. And so we don't argue that that companies have to provide expanded access, but we argue that they have an ethical obligation to think proactively about whether they could or should provide expanded access and under what circumstances, and that should be part of their clinical development planning, and that they should also be willing to communicate their policies openly and transparently with the patients that they're trying to target in the population for the product that they're developing.
What are some of the concerns regarding expanded access? Because obviously you said that within clinical trials, they obviously have like a strict criteria. So what would be some of the kind of concerns from their perspective in that regard?
Well, I mean, certainly, obviously, safety is the utmost concern. So, you know, if a company is developing a product, they you know, in order to get it approved, they have to show that the product is safe and effective. And so, if a patient, for example, is you know, sort of late stage of the disease, the risks of giving an investigational gene therapy product may be very high. In other words, they may have more chance of developing an adverse event or serious effects, or even potentially die from the investigational product. But, you know, they might have an immune reaction that they can't handle. And so for a company developing the product and wanting and with the aim of getting it approved so that it can help other future patients, that's a true, real, valid consideration. But then for that one patient who's willing to take that risk of, you know, of undergoing a significant event because they're facing death or a very poor quality of life without the chance, it's a different calculus. And so so that's why it's a hard thing. But, and again, also these, as you've pointed out, these therapies, even at the investigational stage, are not cheap. They're not easy to deliver. They're not easy to do. But, you know, we are talking about patients' lives. We're not talking about commercial products that are like sneakers or clothing. We're talking about patients' lives here. So I think there are ethical considerations that companies in this space need to think about and take seriously.
Yeah, as you said, I mean, in some situations it is kind of life or death, whether they get a therapy or not. When people think about kind of gene editing, like at the moment, I think the first thing they think of is CRISPR, and how everyone kind of is saying that that's going to kind of revolutionize genetic medicine. When, in your opinion, do you think it is acceptable to clinically use CRISPR or not?
So CRISPR is a really exciting technology, as you say, where scientists just basically in the last decade have learned to leverage a system in bacteria, basically an adaptive immune system that bacteria use to protect themselves against invaders. And scientists have harnessed that system to be able to edit DNA at a place that they want to, using a guide to a particular sequence that can cut and then either replace the DNA or with a sequence that you want to change it to, or another process where the ends just kind of fuse together. So CRISPR has been used in the laboratory for a few years now on all types of cells. So, and of course, CRISPR or gene editing would be an example of gene therapy where you would use it to modify gene expression. And so there are some clinical trials using CRISPR technologies in the United States, and I'm sure also in other countries as well. And I think that there's a general consensus that it would be okay to use CRISPR to try to treat diseases in adults or children that in somatic cells, in other words, cells that are not going to be passed on to the next generation, not germline cells. And that's been going on, that's happening. And I think there are clinical trials in a variety of conditions like sickle cell disease, beta thalassemia, cancers, eye disease, chronic infections. So there's current trials going on, and from what I can tell, some of them look promising. So it's very exciting. I think the more ethically controversial use of CRISPR in terms of a clinical usage would be, which has been covered in the news, is human heritable genome editing. So in other words, modifying an embryo or editing the genes of an embryo before it's put into a woman's body to establish a pregnancy, or potentially, and I haven't seen as many examples of this, future uses of gene editing for not to treat disease, but for enhancement purposes. And I want to stress that that is not happening at this time, as far as I know of.
Yeah, do you think it's ethically okay for someone to use it on themselves? Because I obviously there's loads of like biohackers out there, and I was reading about one the other day that I think he was at some sort of conference a few years ago and injected CRISPR into his arm to supposedly genetically kind of enhance his muscles. Do you think it's ethically okay for people to, obviously because he's doing it to himself, to use it in that regard?
Yeah, so in the US, basically, and again, I'm sorry for my US centricity here, but I think that actually did happen in the US. So there is a potential loophole that, a small people have been publicly known to take advantage of, which is what an example that you're citing right there. And basically, like, the regulatory agencies have kind of just looked the other way, or had regulatory discretion about people who want to, quote, self-experiment with materials that are really are really intended for research or laboratory use. And of course, this is really ill-advised. And the reason for the regulation of investigational products is that many of them are proven unsafe and don't work. And so, and as individuals, we don't have the capability and the resources to evaluate the safety and efficacy. And so there is a system in place, of science and clinical development in all countries to make sure that the products that are for sale are safe and effective. And so I can understand, the sentiment that biohackers seem to express, which is that they want to have access, and that the system of regulation, it impedes access, and also ends up, not everybody can have access because the products are expensive. But I think that it's worth it for politicians and clinicians and ethicists to stress that, these regulatory bodies are really intended to protect individual and public health, and that they're, they're valuable to our society, and we need them. And so, in a sense, it's maybe frustrating on some levels, but I think that the expense of making sure that these products are safe and effective, the ones that companies want to make those claims about, are true.
Yeah, it is, because I was just like watching it, and obviously I think that kind of
the video.
Yeah, and I think that he was kind of saying that he's kind of like an educator as well. And I think it's obviously somewhat like on YouTube as well, like you see these like biohackers like doing loads of things, and obviously that gets like a wide audience, and I just sometimes you don't want it to be kind of detrimental to kind of the field and the progress.
Yeah, no, and I definitely support the democratization of science, and that science should be, available to everybody. But I do also think that there's reasons that there's regulations in place about, even laboratory research can be dangerous. So, I think that I'm of the opinion that it's better to work within the system. And, I think that if you're interested in science, there's ways to get into the system. And I think, so that would be my own personal take. Although I definitely respect the importance of education and bringing people in, of all different kinds of people into science and into thinking about science.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think one of the most prominent things that's kind of happened in the past year, and it's something you kind of alluded to earlier, was the researchers in China who kind of genetically engineered embryos to hopefully make them resistant to HIV. What impact do you think this has had, not only on the kind of field itself, but on public perceptions of this kind of this technology?
So yeah, so I think you're referring to the announcement by Dr. He Jiankui that in November 2018 he had used CRISPR to modify embryos and establish pregnancy, and which resulted in the birth of 2 twin girls who, by my estimates, should be about 2.5 years old. So the world was really stunned when that happened. In fact, I remember being at a CRISPR conference not too long before that announcement, and somebody raised their hand in the audience and said, when is the technology going to be ready to do this in embryos? And the panelists like kind of looked at each other and said, well, somebody actually could probably do that with embryos, but we don't, this would not be advisable, in other words. And then all of a sudden someone did go forward with it, sort of, he was characterized as maybe like a rogue scientist doing this. And certainly he was condemned by, ethicists and scientists, many scientists, and because the concerns were that there was concerns about informed consent of the parents, whether they really knew what they were getting into. There was concerns that he did not need to take this risk of editing the embryo in order to prevent transmission of HIV. So there were alternative procedures, that the risk did not justify the benefits. And so there was this huge outcrying. So certainly, I think in terms of public perception, if there's any silver lining, it certainly has called the world's attention to the fact that the technology has really made huge jumps in the past number of years, so that the public is now aware that this technology is possible. And in response, there have been some international commissions that have been formed in order to start to really think and grapple with the questions of, if not now, when and if ever should we be doing editing of human embryos and establishing pregnancies. And so there's been one commission, the National Academy of Sciences and the UK Royal Society, and they were tasked with developing a framework for scientists and regulators to consider when assessing potential clinical applications for human germline genome editing. Like, if you were to conceive, if a society thinks that this would be acceptable from an ethical standpoint, and that was somewhat of a concern because they kind of put that if to the side and then said, okay, then what would you need to do? Which, as an ethicist, that was concerning, that they just sort of shoved the big ethical questions to the side. And then there was another commission formed by the WHO, and they are tasked with governance and oversight of human genome editing, both somatic and germline genome editing, and they have yet to release their report. But they, the other group, the NASEM report, actually came out with their report last year in 2020.
Yeah, that report last year, I think it said something like germline editing germline editing is far too risky at the moment. But I think a lot of people kind of questioned as well, like I remember reading around that we might be becoming too cautious. What is your kind of opinion on this? Do you think we are becoming too cautious, or do you think that is kind of the right advice?
No, I don't think that they were. So that report basically last year, they basically said that basically the huge message that they wanted to communicate was that the technology needs to be further studied before anyone anywhere establishes pregnancies with edited embryos. So that was the big message that they wanted to convey. But as I said, they also sort of, said, well, if we were to determine, like, how would you figure out when it would be okay? And they sort of made those, you would want to start with the most riskiest cases, there's no other alternatives, those kinds of things. There's like a 300-page report that for anyone who's interested, you could look up, and it's great. But I don't think we're being too cautious, because I think that there's a lot of agreement that the science isn't there yet. There's still concerns. There's concerns about the CRISPR, on target effects. In other words, does the CRISPR intervention do what you intended to do at the site that you're intending to edit? Does it cause unintended effects at the site at sites in the genome that you're not intending to edit? And also, how does the embryo as a whole react to that intervention? These are questions that we don't fully know or understand. I think that more experiments need to be done, and that's the consensus, the clear consensus. And then perhaps equally as important from my perspective as an ethicist is that I think many scientists and ethicists don't feel that we've had a complete and inclusive conversation about, even if from a technical standpoint it would be reasonable to do, once we did all the preclinical research, we feel comfortable and we're done in animals, and now we're ready to try it in humans in very risky scenarios. In other words, there's no other alternative for the parents to have a a gene, a child that's not impacted by a serious genetic disease. But even if that we got to the technical point where we would think that would be a reasonable proposition, we also need to make sure that we have the ethical conversation, because ethicists are concerned about, potential impacts on society and justice issues, which we started to talk about gene therapies earlier, and how these technologies might change our lives or change our societies and our world, basically.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think like as obviously it becomes more integrated, we're going to need to kind of open up the discussion a bit more, especially with the public. But how do you think we could go about doing that? How could we go about trying to ensure that a diverse kind of representation of opinions and voices are heard in these discussions?
Yeah, no, I think it's really certainly a challenge, and sometimes, I've actually expressed my worries that when we talk about reaching consensus, which I even did myself with about, that there's consensus that we shouldn't proceed with, human heritable genome editing at this present time. Um, you know, how do we include everybody in that conversation? And what if there are people who don't disagree? What if there are people who disagree, and if they're the minority, do they just not matter? Or if they don't ever come to agree with the consensus feeling or motion, then what? So I think that in theory we should all be involved in these conversations and in these decisions that societies are going to grapple with. And by all, I mean citizens of the world, as opposed to any one particular country. But in practice, I think it will be important to pay attention to who has the power to make the policy and regulatory and legal decisions, establish laws and policy in each specific country.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I do think also kind of like patient voices and public voices are going to be really important in kind of shaping those kind of policy and regulatory decisions as well, particularly like in terms of like patient advocates and stuff like that, in regards to kind of rare diseases and stuff. They have the kind of voice of the patient. They kind of understand that, and I think that will be really, really important in kind of shaping those decisions.
Yeah, no, I think I hope that's true. And I certainly think the patient voice, they bring the um they bring the urgency and the inspiration to the scientists, really.
Yeah. It's been really, really interesting talking to you. We've had some like really insightful discussions, and I think it is going to be really, really important as we move forward and as genomics becomes even more integrated into society, that we kind of open up these discussions a bit more and start getting the public involved as well. So thank you so much for talking to me today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me to have the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Hello everyone, if you enjoyed this video, then make sure you check out some of our other videos in our series by subscribing below or going to our website, frontlinegenomics.com. I hope you enjoy.